The folder was still warm from the printer. I noticed that first, not the words on the page, not my own name typed in a serif font that looked like it belonged on a gravestone, but the warmth of the paper against my fingers, like it had just been born. Someone had printed this in the last few minutes. Someone had printed this while I was 3 rooms away, propped up on pillows, learning how to hold a spoon again. I had been awake for 9 days, out of the coma for 9 days, out of the hospital for 2. My hands still shook when I tried to do ordinary things, sign my name, button a cardigan, hold a cup without both palms wrapped around it like a child. My sister Paige said the doctors called this normal. She said it gently, the way you'd talk to someone you'd already decided wasn't quite all the way back yet. She had left the folder on the kitchen counter by mistake. Or not by mistake. I'd think about that distinction for a long time afterward, turn it over the way you turn over a stone to see what's living underneath. She'd gone out to take a phone call, and the folder sat there next to the fruit bowl, manila, unlabeled, the kind of folder you use when you don't want anyone asking what's inside it. I opened it because I was bored, and because boredom after 3 weeks of not existing has a particular texture to it, a hunger for anything that proves the world kept moving without you. The first page was my obituary. Not a draft of sympathy cards, not a hospital form, an obituary, past tense, finished sentences, a paragraph about how I would be remembered as a devoted daughter and sister, how I had touched the lives of everyone around me, how the family asked for privacy during this difficult time. My name, my birth date, a blank where the date of death should go, the cursor of someone's intention hovering there, waiting. Stapled behind it was a second document, a spreadsheet printed in landscape, columns I recognized because I had built spreadsheets like this myself for clients for 12 years. Assets, beneficiaries. A column titled Agreed Split Asterisk, with percentages that didn't match anything I had ever signed, names filled in next to things that were mine. The lake property, the brokerage account, the silver that had come down through my grandmother's side of the family, the kind of silver nobody uses anymore but everyone wants. Next to the lake property, in my mother's handwriting, someone had written, Trevor plus Paige, 50-50, once finalized. Once finalized. I sat at the kitchen table with the folder open in front of me, and I did not call out. I did not cry, though I want to be honest and say some part of me expected to. I had spent 3 weeks somewhere with no language and no shape, and I had come back into a body that still didn't fully obey me, and the first real piece of information the world handed me was that my family had begun dividing what was mine, while there was still a heartbeat attached to it. I closed the folder. I lined its edges up exactly the way I'd found them. I put it back beside the fruit bowl, at the same angle, the way you'd return a borrowed book before anyone notices you've read the ending. Then I went back to my room, lay down on top of the covers, and stared at the ceiling fan until Paige came back inside, laughing at something on the phone, her voice light and easy, a woman with nothing to hide making sure she sounded like a woman with nothing to hide. I decided, somewhere in that hour, that I would say nothing, not because I was afraid, because I wanted to see how far they would go while they believed no one was watching. It would be 6 months before I said a single word about what I'd read. To understand why I didn't scream that afternoon, you have to understand what it meant to be the third child in my family, and you have to understand my grandmother, Vivian, because nothing that happened later makes sense without her. I was born last, 4 years after Trevor and almost 6 after Paige, which in a family like mine meant I arrived after the roles had already been cast. Trevor was the one who'd inherit the name, and everyone assumed the responsibility, the steady one, the one my father took to the hardware store on Saturdays to learn things he never actually learned. Paige was the bright one, the one who got the school photos enlarged and framed, who learned piano because my mother had always wanted to learn piano and saw an easier way to do it through her daughter. I arrived into a house that had already decided what kind of family it was, and there wasn't a slot left over that fit me. So I found my own. I became the quiet one, which is a role you can build out of necessity faster than you'd think. You simply stop offering things up, and people stop expecting you to. My grandmother, Vivian, was the only person who seemed to notice that quiet isn't the same as empty. She was my father's mother, which made her an outsider in my mother's house in her own particular way, tolerated more than embraced, the way some families tolerate a gray tant's opinions at Thanksgiving and call it generosity. She lived 40 minutes away in a house she'd bought herself in 1974, back when a woman buying a house herself was still considered a small act of defiance, and she drove an old Buick that she refused to replace because, she said, a car that still runs owes you nothing. Vivian saw me. I don't know how else to put it. While the rest of the house organized itself around Trevor's potential and Paige's performances, Vivian would sit with me at her kitchen table doing nothing in particular, shelling peas, folding laundry, the kind of tasks that don't require conversation but somehow produce the best conversation anyway, and she would ask me what I thought. Not what I'd done that week, not how school was. What I thought about a news story. About a neighbor's decision. About whether the peach tree in her backyard would make it through another winter. Nobody else asked me that question. It is a strange thing to realize, even now, how much of a child's sense of self gets built on the rare adult who simply asks what's in their head and then waits, genuinely, for the answer. You watch everything, she told me once. I was maybe 14. We were sitting on her porch, and Trevor had just had some minor triumph back at the house, a basketball game, I think, and the whole family had gone to see it, and I had begged off with a headache that wasn't real. You watch everything, and you say nothing, and everyone in that house thinks that means you don't have opinions. They're going to be wrong about you for a very long time, Margaret. Don't let it bother you. Being wrong about somebody is exhausting work, and eventually they'll get tired of doing it. By then, you'll already know exactly who you are. I didn't understand what she meant, not fully, not then. I understood it better at 26, when I started my own small accounting practice instead of joining the firm my father had lined up for me, a decision that produced exactly the kind of bewildered disappointment in my mother that confirmed everything Vivian had ever told me about being underestimated. I understood it even better in my 30s, watching Trevor's businesses fail twice on borrowed family money while mine quietly, unglamorously, did not. By then the role had calcified the way roles do. Trevor, ambitious. Paige, accomplished. Margaret, fine, I suppose, doing her little books for people. Nobody in my family ever asked what I'd built. They didn't ask because they'd already decided, long before I built anything, exactly how much room I was allowed to take up. Vivian asked. Vivian always asked. And in the last years of her life, when her hands had started to shake the way mine would shake decades later in that hospital, she gave me something else, not money, not yet, but a habit she said had saved her more than once. Read everything twice, she told me, the week before she went into the hospital for the last time. The first read is for what it says. The second read is for what it's trying to make you assume it says. People will hand you a true sentence sitting right next to a false implication and let your eyes carry the false part along for free. Read it twice. Always. I didn't know yet how much I would need that. Vivian died 11 months before I went into the coma. She was 83, and it was not sudden, and it was not, by any reasonable measure, tragic. She had lived a long, deliberate life, and she died in her own bed having put nearly everything in order herself, with a lawyer she'd used for 30 years, and trusted the way some people trust a sibling. What was not in order, or rather what looked perfectly in order and wasn't, was how the family received the news of what she'd left behind. The will was simple on its face. The house went to my father, since he was her only child. With the understanding, stated plainly, in writing, that he'd sell it and split the proceeds with his children, since he and my mother had a home of their own already and didn't need a second one slowly emptying of meaning 40 minutes down the road. The Buick, absurdly, went to Trevor, who Vivian had once described as a boy who needs to learn that a car running fine is its own kind of luck, which Trevor took as an honor, and I took, privately, as one last small joke at his expense that he'd never catch. And there was a trust. Not enormous. Vivian had been comfortable, not wealthy, but real. A piece of lakefront land she'd bought in the 70s for almost nothing, before that whole stretch of shoreline became the kind of address people now mortgaged themselves to reach. A modest brokerage account that had compounded quietly for 40 years because she never touched it. The silver, which had come down through her own mother, which nobody but me had ever actually asked to see or hold or learn the history of. All of it went to me. Not because Vivian loved me more, though I believe in my private heart that in some uncomplicated way she did. She explained her reasoning in a letter the lawyer gave me along with the documents, and I have read that letter more times than I can count, and I am not going to recite all of it here, because some things are mine and should stay mine. But the shape of her reasoning was this. Trevor and Paige had parents who would help them, who had already helped them, repeatedly, visibly, financially, in ways everyone in the family discussed openly at dinner like it was simply how families worked. I had built what I had alone, asked for nothing, and would likely keep asking for nothing for the rest of my life out of the same stubborn quiet that had defined me since childhood. She didn't want that stubbornness to cost me the one thing she had to give that might actually change my footing in the world. I am not leaving you more because you deserve more asterisk, she wrote. I am leaving you this because you would never take it for yourself, and someone has to make sure you don't go through your whole life with both hands empty out of pride. I read it twice the way she taught me, the first time for grief, the second time for what it meant. What it meant, in practical terms, was that I became, overnight, without asking to be, the only one of my father's 3 children who held something the other 2 believed they were owed. Nobody said this to my face. That's the part worth understanding about my family. We are not a family that fights at the table. We are a family that smiles at the table and then makes phone calls afterward. Paige called me 3 days after the funeral to ask, very casually, whether I'd thought at all about what made sense for the lake property, long-term. Given that I lived 2 states away and barely used it, and wouldn't it be more practical for the family to manage it collectively, the way Dad managed Vivian's other affairs while she was alive? I told her I hadn't decided anything yet. This was true. I had decided, in fact, to decide nothing out loud, to let the property sit in my name, quiet, the way I had learned to sit in rooms quiet, watching what people did when they thought no one was keeping track. Trevor's call came 2 weeks later, framed as concern about my finances, an offer to help me think through whether the brokerage account should be reinvested somewhere he had connections, a friend who managed money, very reputable, very good returns. I told him I'd think about it too. I want to be clear that I don't believe, even now, that either of them sat down and consciously plotted to take something from me. I think it was simpler and uglier than that. I think they genuinely believed, in the unexamined way people believe things about siblings they've spent a lifetime underestimating, that I wouldn't know what to do with what I'd been given, and that not knowing what to do with it meant it would eventually, naturally, sensibly flow toward the people who did. I went home after that second call and did the one thing I'd been putting off since the funeral. I called Vivian's lawyer, a careful, dry man named Halloran who had outlived 2 of his own law partners and apparently intended to outlive a third, and I asked him to walk me through every document, every account, every signature requirement, line by line, twice. Smart, he said when I told him why. Most people only read it once. The accident happened on a Tuesday in March, 11 months after Vivian's funeral. On a stretch of wet highway I'd driven 100 times without thinking about it once. I don't remember the impact. I remember the truck's headlights doing something wrong in my rearview mirror, too bright, too close, and then I remember nothing at all for 3 weeks, which is a strange thing to write, because for 3 weeks I was a person other people kept talking asterisk about while I wasn't anywhere to talk back. Here is what I've pieced together since, from hospital records, from things Paige let slip before she learned to be more careful, from the particular silences certain questions produced in certain people. I was in a coma for 3 weeks. Induced, partly, then not the kind that has doctors using careful language with families, words like asterisk monitoring and responsive to some stimuli, and increasingly, as the days went on, we'll know more in time asterisk, a phrase that means almost nothing and yet seems to organize entire families around its emptiness like a compass. My father, by his own account later, had to think practically. He has used that phrase to me directly since, without apparent self-consciousness, and I have come to understand it as the truest sentence he's ever said to me, because it explains everything that followed. Thinking practically, in my father's vocabulary, meant calling Halloran's office during week 2 to ask what would happen to Vivian's trust in the event. A phrase he also used without apparent self-consciousness, as if the event were whether rather than his daughter's death. Halloran, to his enduring credit, told me about that call himself, months later, with the same dry economy he used for everything. I told him the trust has its own instructions regardless of what anyone in the family thinks would be practical, he said. He didn't love that answer. People rarely do. What my father could not get from Halloran, my mother apparently tried to get from somewhere else, namely, from the bank that held my personal accounts, separate from anything Vivian had left me, the ordinary checking and savings of a woman who had built a small accounting practice over 12 careful years. She went in with my hospital paperwork and a notarized power of attorney form, the kind hospitals sometimes ask families to have ready in case decisions need to be made quickly, and asked, gently, what the procedure would be for accessing funds for ongoing expenses while I was incapacitated. I want to be precise here, because precision is the only thing I have ever owed anyone in this story, including myself. A power of attorney for medical decisions is not the same as authority over financial accounts. My mother either did not understand this distinction or chose, in that hallway, not to make it visible to the bank officer she was speaking to. The bank, also to its credit, declined to act on anything beyond what the document actually authorized, and the conversation went nowhere, and nobody told me about it until much later, by accident, in a conversation Paige didn't realize she was having with someone who already knew how to listen for the false implication sitting next to the true sentence. Meanwhile, at home, in the kitchen that had once been Vivian's kind of kitchen table conversation and was now becoming something else entirely, the actual planning had begun. Paige, it turned out, had taken the lead on what she called, in a text message to Trevor that I would not see for months, getting ahead of things so nobody's scrambling later. She had pulled up old emails between us about the lake property. She had asked our mother to find any paperwork Vivian had left regarding the silver. She had, 3 days before I opened my eyes, begun drafting language for an obituary, because, and I believe she believed this part, the doctors had used a phrase in a family meeting that frightened everyone badly enough that getting ahead of things started to feel less like opportunism, and more, in Paige's mind, like responsible preparation for the worst. I don't say this to excuse what came next. I say it because the truth of my family was never that they were monsters. The truth was something quieter and more common, and in some ways more disturbing for being so common. Ordinary people under pressure will often discover that the line between preparing for grief and positioning for inheritance is thinner than they'd like to believe, and they will cross it without feeling the crossing at all. I woke up on a Thursday. Nobody had been drafting anything for at least 4 days by then, since the doctors had upgraded their language from "will know more in time" to encouraging signs, and the obituary draft should, by any reasonable accounting, have been deleted, shredded, forgotten. It wasn't. It was printed. It was sitting in a folder by the fruit bowl, still warm from the printer, 9 days after I came back into my own name. I want to tell you what the next 6 months looked like from the outside, because the outside was the entire performance, and the performance is the part my family will remember, if they ever tell this story themselves, as the period when I was still healing and not quite myself yet. I was, in fact, exactly myself. More myself, in some ways, than I had been in years, because for the first time since I was 14 years old on Vivian's porch, I had stopped wondering whether my family's version of me was accurate. I knew, with the particular clarity that comes from holding a folder in your own 2 unsteady hands, exactly how accurate it was. So I played the part they had already written for me. I let Paige bring me soup. I let Trevor set up a ramp by the back door that I genuinely needed for 2 weeks and didn't need after that, but used anyway, slowly, deliberately, because a woman moving slowly is a woman people stop watching closely. I let my mother sit with me in the evenings and talk about how frightened everyone had been, how close it had come, how grateful she was, every word of it probably true and none of it the whole truth, and I nodded and said I was grateful too, which was also true, in its own narrow way. I was grateful to be alive. I was simply no longer willing to be naive about who I was alive with asterisk. What I did instead of confronting any of them was the only thing I had ever been good at. I watched. I listened. I read everything twice. I asked Halloran, in our first real phone call after I was strong enough to hold a conversation longer than 10 minutes, to send me copies of everything related to Vivian's trust from the past year, every inquiry, every call log his office kept, every document anyone outside of me had requested information about. He didn't ask why. He'd been doing this work long enough to recognize the shape of the question. I asked my own bank, separately, quietly, for a full log of account access attempts during the 3 weeks I was unreachable. That took 4 phone calls and 1 in-person visit, made alone, in a wheelchair I genuinely still needed at the time, which I have since come to understand made the bank manager considerably more cooperative than she might otherwise have been. People underestimate a woman in a wheelchair asking careful questions about her own money. It is, I've learned, one of the most useful things in the world to be underestimated while doing. I found the power of attorney form my mother had presented. I found the date stamp on it. I found, 3 weeks later, in a much harder conversation with Halloran than the first one, that someone, and I will tell you who, and how I learned it later, when this story reaches the place it's supposed to reach, had also approached his office directly, not about the trust's instructions this time, but about whether a asterisk codicil could still be added to Vivian's existing will, to reflect the family's understanding of her wishes, given that she could no longer clarify them herself. Vivian had been dead for almost a year by then. I am going to ask you to sit with me for a moment in that detail, because it is the hinge on which everything that follows turns, and I want you to feel the particular cold of it the way I felt it, alone, in my kitchen, with the phone still warm against my ear from Halloran's voice. Someone had tried to add language to a dead woman's will, using my coma as the moment when no one would be watching closely enough to notice. If you are watching this, and you have ever sat in a hospital corridor not knowing whether someone you love is coming back, or if you've ever realized, after the fact, that some of the people around that bed weren't entirely there for the reasons they claimed, I want you to put it in the comments below. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, and tell me the moment you knew, really knew, who in your family could be trusted with the truth and who could only be trusted with a performance of it. I read every one of these, and some nights they are the only thing that makes a story like this feel like it was worth telling all the way through. I didn't call Halloran's bluff that day, and he didn't need me to. He had already told whoever asked, calmly, that no such codicil was possible or appropriate, that Vivian's will was settled law the moment she died, and would remain settled law regardless of how anyone currently felt about it. But he gave me something more useful than a refusal. He gave me a name, the way careful men sometimes do when they've decided whose side they're actually on. I didn't use that name yet. I wasn't ready, and more importantly, I didn't yet have enough. Vivian had taught me to read twice, and I intended to read this entire situation as many times as it took before I said a single word out loud. So I kept healing, visibly, slowly, gratefully, in front of everyone. And underneath that, in rooms nobody else walked into, I kept building a folder of my own, quieter, more careful, and considerably more accurate than the one I'd found beside the fruit bowl the day I came home. It took me 4 months to understand the full shape of what had been happening, and I want to walk through it the way I actually pieced it together, because the order matters. I didn't find one smoking document and call it done. I built it the way I'd built every audit I'd ever run for a client, one small inconsistency at a time, until the inconsistencies stopped being separate things and became a pattern with a name attached. The name Halloran gave me belonged to a notary named Dale Petrosky, who ran a small office above a dry cleaner's 2 towns over, and who, it turned out, had notarized the power of attorney form my mother presented to my bank. That wouldn't have meant anything on its own, notaries notarize things. That's the whole job. Except that when I requested a copy of the form itself, with my own signature on it, I read it the way Vivian taught me. Twice. The first read showed me my name, my signature, a date 3 days into my coma. The second read showed me that the signature wasn't mine. It was close. Whoever had done it had clearly practiced. They'd gotten the slant of my M right, the way I dropped the crossbar on my T a little low. But I have signed my own name on financial documents for 12 years running an accounting practice, and there is a specific, almost unconscious hitch in how I form the second syllable of my own last name. A small hesitation that comes from a childhood spent practicing a signature I didn't yet believe belonged to me. The forgery didn't have the hitch. It was too smooth. It was the signature of someone confident they were allowed to write it, and I have never once, in my whole life, signed my own name feeling confident I was allowed to. I sat with that for a long time before I did anything about it, because there's a particular vertigo that comes with realizing someone forged your name while you were unconscious enough not to stop them. It is different from theft. Theft takes something you have. This took something that was supposed to be unforgeable precisely because it was *U, and somebody had decided that while I was elsewhere, I didn't fully count as the owner of my own identity. I called Halloran with the comparison laid out, old signed documents next to the new one, and asked him, as calmly as I could manage, who had legal authority to investigate a forged power of attorney used in an attempt to access funds. "That's not a family matter anymore," he said. "That's a fraud matter. You understand the difference." I told him I did. I asked him to hold everything exactly where it was for a little longer. The reason I asked him to wait was Paige's text messages, which I finally saw in full that same month, because Paige, who managed our shared family photo cloud account, the one we'd set up years earlier to swap pictures of nieces and nephews, had at some point also linked an old backup of her phone to it without realizing the backup synced more than photos. I found it by accident, looking for a picture of Vivian from a Christmas years back, and what I found instead was a folder of exported message threads Paige had apparently saved to send to a lawyer she'd consulted, just in case. And never deleted. I read it once for what it said, then I read it again. What it said the first time through was a sister managing a frightening situation. "We need a plan in case the worst happens. Mom's a mess. Someone has to be the practical one. Read quickly in grief. It could pass for love wearing an ugly coat." What it said the second time was dates. The obituary draft had begun 9 days after the accident, the same week doctors first used the phrase encouraging signs in a family meeting Paige had attended. She'd kept drafting it for 4 more days after that, refining the spreadsheet, after the prognosis had already turned. And in a message to Trevor dated the day before I woke up, she'd written, "If she comes out of this slower than before, we should already have language ready that frames us managing things for her, not around her. People believe family helping family. Get Mom to use the POA language loosely if anyone at the bank pushes back. Doesn't need to be airtight, just needs to buy time till we're set up properly. Doesn't need to be airtight, just needs to buy time." I have read a great many things in my life that hurt me less than that sentence, because it told me, in Paige's own words, that the forgery wasn't an accident of panic. It was a strategy, drafted by someone fully conscious, fully recovered from whatever fear she genuinely felt in that family meeting, who had decided that my coma was a window of opportunity worth exploiting properly *, with the right language, the right framing, the right amount of plausible deniability built in from the start. Trevor's reply, 11 minutes later, was 4 words long: "Whatever works. Keep me out of paperwork." I want to tell you that reading those 4 words broke something in me. It didn't quite. What it did was something colder and more useful. It told me exactly how much courage Trevor actually had, enough to take half of a lake property, not enough to put his name on a single document that obtained it. Which meant the entire scheme, whatever it became, had exactly one architect, and I now knew her handwriting. I spent the 5th month doing something my family would never have predicted from me, mostly because they had spent 30 years deciding what I was, and weren't capable of without ever once asking. I built a case file the way I would have built one for a client suspected of being defrauded by their own bookkeeper, methodically, with dates, with originals, with everything cross-referenced twice. I had Halloran's records of the codicil inquiry, with names and timestamps. I had the bank's access log showing my mother's attempt and the date stamp on the POA form. I had the forensic signature comparison, which I paid a document examiner to formalize properly, because I wanted something beyond my own trained eye when the moment came to show it to people who hadn't spent 12 years staring at signatures for a living. I had Paige's own exported messages, dated, time-stamped, unambiguous, in her own words, to Trevor, about a plan built around the specific window of my incapacity. And I had the obituary, the original folder, photographed exactly as I'd found it the day I came home, before I ever put it back by the fruit bowl. I had taken the photographs with my shaking hands that very first afternoon, 9 days after waking up, because some instinct in me, the same instinct Vivian had spent my whole childhood quietly cultivating, understood immediately that the version of events my family would tell later would not match the version sitting in that folder, and that someone, someday, would need proof of which version was true. What I did not have, and did not want, was a plan for revenge in the way people usually mean that word. I didn't want to humiliate anyone at a holiday table. I didn't want a viral confrontation. I am not, despite the folder of evidence I'd assembled, a person who enjoys watching other people suffer, even people who tried to take from me while I couldn't speak for myself. What I wanted was simpler, and, I think, harder to argue with. I wanted the truth on the record, in a room where it couldn't be smiled away afterward, with consequences attached that were proportionate, legal, and impossible to later reframe as a misunderstanding between siblings who just handle things differently. So I called a lawyer of my own, not Halloran, who represented Vivian's estate and had been generous enough already, but a woman named Ortiz who specialized in elder and incapacity fraud, and who listened to my entire account without interrupting once, which I have come to believe is the rarest professional courtesy in the world. "You have more here than most people bring me after years of suspecting something," she said when I finished. "The question is what you actually want, because what you have could support a criminal fraud referral regarding the forged POA. It could support a civil action for the attempted asset reallocation. Or," she paused, "it could simply be the thing you put on the table once calmly and let them understand you could have gone further and chose not to. Some people want all three. Some people just want the second thing to never happen to them again." I told her I needed a week to decide. I want to be honest that I did not spend that week thinking about justice in the abstract. I spent it thinking about Vivian's porch, about a 14-year-old being told that people who are wrong about you for long enough eventually get tired of being wrong, and about whether forcing my family to stop being wrong about me required burning the house down or simply turning all the lights on at once and letting them see the room clearly for the first time. I decided on the lights. I asked for a family meeting at my parents' house, 6 months almost to the day after I'd opened that folder by the fruit bowl. I told them I wanted to talk about moving forward and the lake property, language deliberately chosen because it was the language Paige herself had used with me months earlier in that first careful phone call. I wanted her to hear her own words coming back before she understood why. I brought Ortiz with me. I hadn't told anyone that part in advance. My mother made coffee nobody drank. My father sat at the head of the table the way he always had, a man who believed presiding over a room was the same thing as understanding it. Trevor arrived 12 minutes late, the way he always did, as though punctuality were a concession he'd decided not to make to family functions specifically. Paige sat across from me, and I watched her face do the small private calculations she always did before any conversation that mattered, deciding in advance which version of herself the room required. I didn't raise my voice. I want that understood clearly because I know how stories like this one sometimes get told, as eruptions, as long overdue screaming matches finally letting out years of pressure. That isn't what happened, and it isn't who I am, and it isn't, frankly, what Vivian raised me to become. I opened a folder of my own, set it in the middle of the table, and started reading. Not shouting, reading. The way you'd read a closing statement, because in every way that mattered, that's exactly what it was. I read the obituary draft's metadata, the creation date 9 days after the accident. I read the bank's log of the access attempt, the date the POA form was presented, and the forensic examiner's conclusion about the signature beside it. I read, last, 2 lines from Paige's own message to Trevor, the ones about not needing the paperwork to be airtight, about buying time. I had promised myself I would only read what was necessary, nothing more, no humiliation for its own sake, and I kept that promise, though it cost me something to keep it gently. My mother went very pale and started to say something about how frightened she'd been, how she'd only been trying to help, and I let her finish, because I believed then and believe now that her fear, at least, was real, even if the form it took wasn't defensible. Trevor said almost nothing, which told me everything I already knew about where the architecture had actually come from. Paige said, "You don't understand what those weeks were like for us." And I said, as steadily as I could, "I understand exactly what they were like for you. I have your own words describing it. What I'm asking you to understand is what it's like to find out, 9 days after waking up from a coma, that the people closest to you had already started writing your obituary in the past tense before your heart had agreed to stop." Nobody had an answer for that. There isn't one. Ortiz, who had said nothing up to that point, then explained, in the calm procedural language of someone who does this for a living and has lost any appetite for drama about it, exactly what I had the standing to pursue. And exactly what I had decided, for now, not to pursue. The forged POA would be reported to the bank's fraud department as a matter of record, regardless of what happened next, because a forged signature attached to financial access doesn't simply get to disappear because a family apologizes around a coffee pot. That protection exists for the next person, not just for me. Beyond that, I was choosing not to escalate on one condition. A written, lawyer-reviewed acknowledgement from all 3 of them that the trust, the lake property, and every asset within it belonged to me, solely, with no further family conversations about reallocation, ever again. I watched my father's face when he understood I wasn't asking. I had stopped asking the day I found that folder. They signed it, all 3 of them in front of Ortiz, in the same kitchen where the original folder had once sat warm beside a fruit bowl. That was 8 months ago now. I would like to tell you that signing a document changed my family overnight into people who see me clearly, the way Vivian always did. That isn't true, and I think stories that promise an ending like that are usually lying a little, smoothing the real texture of things into something more satisfying than honest. What actually changed is smaller, and I think more durable. My father calls more often, and the calls are stranger now, careful, a man trying to recalibrate 30 years of assumptions in real time and not quite managing it, but trying. My mother apologized once properly, without the word asterisk but anywhere in the sentence, and I have chosen to believe that apology, because believing it costs me nothing and refusing it would only cost me peace I'd rather keep. Trevor and I speak the way people speak who both know something was done and never discuss its name. It isn't warmth, but it isn't pretense either, and that's more than I expected from him. Paige and I do not speak often. When we do, it's careful, formal, the kind of careful that 2 people build between them when one of them has read the other's own handwriting describing a plan to exploit her unconsciousness, and both of them know it, and pretending otherwise would insult whatever respect is left between them. I don't know if that changes with time. I've stopped needing it to. The lake property is mine, fully, without footnotes. I go up there now most summers, alone sometimes, and I sit on the dock in the evenings the way Vivian used to sit on her porch, watching the light do what light does over water, asking myself the kinds of questions she used to ask me. I had the silver appraised, and then I had it cleaned instead, because some things are worth more used than sold. I think about her constantly up there, more than anywhere else, and I think she would have found the whole 6 months, in her own dry way, more satisfying than tragic. Not because she enjoyed conflict, but because she spent so much of her life being quietly correct about people in a family that never thought to ask her, and she would have recognized immediately that I had finally learned to do the same. I run my practice the way I always have, 12 years now turned 13, unglamorous, profitable, entirely my own. I still don't take up much room at family gatherings when there are family gatherings. But I've noticed something new in the room when I'm quiet now. Nobody assumes the quiet means empty anymore. I think that's the actual inheritance Vivian left me, not the lake house, not the silver, not even the money. The proof finally arrived at in my own hands that being underestimated for long enough doesn't have to be a wound. It can be cover. It can be the only window in the room nobody thinks to check. I think often about that warm folder by the fruit bowl, and about how close I came to never opening it. How if I'd been 5 minutes later coming into that kitchen, or if Paige had remembered to take it with her, I might never have known any of it happened at all. I might have spent years wondering, in some unnamed corner of myself, why certain conversations about the lake property always felt a half step ahead of where I'd left them. Why certain documents always seemed to already have an opinion about my future before I'd formed one myself. I don't think every family does what mine did. I want to be careful about that, because it would be easy, telling a story like this one, to let it curdle into something bitter about families in general, and that isn't the truth I want to leave you with. Most of the people who write to me after stories like this aren't writing about monsters. They're writing about ordinary people who, under enough fear and enough pressure, discovered a version of themselves they didn't know was in there. The version willing to forge a signature, or draft an obituary early, or stay quiet about 4 words typed to a brother. I don't think that excuses it. I think it explains it, and I've learned there's an important difference between the two, the same difference between reading something once and reading it twice. If there's one thing I'd ask you to carry out of this story, it's Vivian's habit, the one she handed me on her porch before I understood why I'd need it. Read everything twice. The people who love you rarely need a second read to prove it. It's the ones who don't that count on you only ever reading once. Thank you for sitting with this story tonight. If it meant something to you, if some piece of it found a piece of your own life, tell me in the comments. I read everyone, and I'll see you in the next story.